kind of observations about current disconnections, and then the implications of those disconnections, and then finally an example of how this all plays out. Wasnas and Tisnigasan, Pamaskatapan, Opaskwayak, Ochinina from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. And that's on the Saskatchewan River system, part of the Saskatchewan River Delta. And today I'm here at the confluence of the Yukon and Takini rivers in Whitehorse, which is the traditional territory of 4 different Indigenous nations. And I'm here by invitation. And my background is in relational psychology. I'm trained as a clinician, but I'm not a clinician. So my focus is on research and pedagogy, and then land-based practice, as was mentioned. So just starting with my own understanding of what psychology means from an Indigenous paradigm. In English, psyche is the soul, but in Cree, psyche is spirit. So soul and spirit are synonymous. And as many of you Cree speakers know, our word for spirit is achak. And it's the same word for star, achakos. So there's an understanding that there's a connection or a link, not a star link, a connection from our individual selves to the wider universe. And so there's always a link between self and cosmology. And so that's kind of the basis of understanding psychology from an Indigenous worldview. So within that worldview, it is not self in relation, but rather self as relation. And it's not just a principle or an ethic. It's really an understanding that shapes our way of being and who we are. So even in introducing myself, my name, that's explains my relationship to land and the cosmos, but also my responsibility. So the relationality and relational accountability, which is an ontological shift from the way Western psychology understands the self as self in relation. And built into that ontology is an understanding of humility as well. And, that's expressed through our languages that come from our land. And, for example, Kanisatachak or Kichimantu, the great mystery, great spirit. There's really this understanding that we will never know everything, but yet we are related to everything. So is that like everything everywhere all at once? Kind of, but not really. And so this just kind of reminds me of, some of you probably saw that movie, but in the introduction, Celeste was talking about pseudo-psychology, and I think it's just become really pervasive. And when I was on the plane coming to Whitehorse, my little monitor wasn't working, and I wanted to really watch a movie. And so, I just pressed on it, and then it wasn't working, pressed on it again, and then got out a tissue and wiped it off, cleaned it, pressed it, and still wasn't working. And the flight attendant came up and she said, "Oh, do you want me to reset it?" So she reset it. And the other flight attendant came. She said, "Oh, should I reset that?" And I was still pressing on it. Even like once I tried to punch it, like almost resorting to violence. And then, the 2 flight attendants bumped in the aisle and they said, "Oh, I reset it twice." And they both had reset it twice. And I'm like, "It's okay. I don't need to really watch a movie." And one of them put her arm on my shoulder and she said, "Would you like a book?" And I said, "Sure." So she went and came back and she brought this book. I forget what the name is, Stillness and Silence or something like that, or Sit Still maybe. But it was a book by Eckhart Tolle. And so I read the book during the flight, and I thought it was really interesting because, well, there is a chapter on nature and a chapter on relationships. And when I was getting off the plane, I gave the book back to the flight attendant, and she said, "How did you like it?" And I said, "It's okay." And I said, "There's a lot of kind of themes that kind of come from an Indigenous worldview or Cree worldview. And she goes, yeah, it is very simplistic. Yeah. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's the understanding. And that's what people want. They want simple, surface level understandings, when in reality, our understandings of identity and the connection to land and really the universe are so deep. And so that kind of leads to this topic of disconnection. So we know that through, colonial practices, genocide, that there has been intentional disconnection from us, from our land-based knowledge and the transmission of land-based knowledge, which, is epistemicide. And I think some of the result of that is seen in the way that, there's a focus on the tip of the iceberg aspects of identity. And that tip of the iceberg kind of approach limits and regulates the possibilities for Indigenous identities, while at the same time it opens up possibility for non-Indigenous people to take on our identities. And so, sometimes that just means putting on really super long beaded earrings or skirts, and people can kind of just shapeshift into our communities. And so for men, I'm not sure what, maybe just having black hair, I don't know. So there's different identity markers that really are linked to kind of superficial parts of identity that are often, and very much so in our own traditions and culture, linked to ancient philosophy and worldview, but they can easily be skimmed off by others. And then as well, because of colonial policy, many Indigenous people have been disconnected from that knowledge too. So that's all they have. And that can become internalized. And the implications for all of these disconnections amidst our current context, which is a national mental health crisis and a global climate crisis, the implications or the impacts of disconnection are profound. One of the manifestations we see is like the increased use of social media as a way for people to negotiate and understand their identities. It allows for a multitude of surface level discussions and spaces as well, but it's also problematic because they are just that superficial often, or surface level. And then it also leads to this hyper articulated identities. So for example, we've gone from two-spirit to Legitimaquah, and now it's like, it's not even an acronym anymore, it's become a term. And even within that, bears, otters, cubs, ninjas, and my favorite, golden retriever masked lesbians. And so, it's come highly hyper articulated. And then connected to that also is the commodification of identities. So each of those becoming commodified. And then an implication is that certain styles of leadership are rewarded, but not just rewarded, they're also highly desirable or desired. And so there's the white supremacy that was talked about earlier, but also straight supremacy as well. And so certain themes in research and practice are rewarded and also highly desired or desirable. But meanwhile, we're just trying to keep our kids alive, our students alive, not just K to 12, but, post-secondary and even the graduate level. So as an educator, these implications are really amplified and we see them playing out every day. And then finally, I want to talk about how this has kind of rolled out or played out within the Two-Spirit movement or Two-Spirit community, in particular with regard to Two-Spirit pretendians. There's been an increase in Two-Spirit pretendians, but they haven't garnered the same kind of national attention from academics and from community, but also from from mainstream media in the ways that others have. But yet their impact has been in some ways subtle, but in other ways extremely profound. So it's research, creative writing, and other forms of scholarship that have really contributed to the shaping of the discipline of queer Indigenous studies, and I would say Indigenous studies in general, but also education and many other disciplines. And most importantly, I think, is for us to recognize that Two-Spirit Pretendians have contributed to the meaning of the term Two-Spirit and to the Two-Spirit movement itself, to the research agenda and the trajectory of research, which really ultimately means they have contributed to shaping identity, contributed to shaping what Two-Spirit identity is and what the movement is. And Two-Spirit is, a spiritual identity. And as I mentioned, we're trying to keep people alive. It's not just youth, the suicide rates, pardon me, they haven't gone down in the past 30 years that I've been working in this field and doing research. And it's not just youth, it's, middle-aged people and elders as well. And so there is agency and a link to spirit and, again, cosmology that is powerful in the term Two-Spirit. And that's the reason people started using it as a self-proclaimer, but also as a movement. And so I kind of want to end with that to help people understand how pervasive the issue is, and then some of the implications, and also to allow us to be able to question how the deep psychology of pretendians has impacted really the lives of people. And to end, I'll just leave with a quote by pseudo-psychologist Eckhart Tolle, because I'll acknowledge the relationality to that flight attendant who gave me that book. But there's one quote in there that said, "Reincarnation doesn't help you if in your next incarnation you still don't know who you are." So Kinanuskmit, no, thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Miigwech, Dr. Wilson. Now we'll turn to Dr. Ansloos.
Can everybody hear me okay? Can I just get like a thumbs up if my audio is coming through? Okay, great. Well, Tansei, it's so nice to see some familiar faces, some dear colleagues, some friends, some students, and even some family in this Zoom chat. So it's really good to be with you all today. I want to begin by acknowledging the territory and the land and water where I'm located today. I'm kind of actually on the other side of the world. I'm joining you today from Whadjuk territory in the Noongar Nation, colonially known as Perth, Australia. And I want to acknowledge the elders here, past, present, emerging, and future, and to say that I stand in solidarity with them in our nation's interconnected struggles against Canadian and global mining corporations, and their occupation of these territories and their ongoing poisoning of water. Today is World Water Day, and I think about the fact that in Canada, many First Nations continue to live in conditions of tremendous indignity without access to clean drinking water. My name is Jeffrey Ansloos. I'm a citizen of Fisher River Cree Nation in Manitoba. I grew up off reserve in Winnipeg, although I've spent significant time in our territory and also living up near Norway House and Knee Lake and Utic Lake in the north. My mother is Sherry Ansloos, or by her birth name, Lisa Dawn Stevenson. And she's the daughter of my grandmother, Mekukam Selina. And our relatives to this day live in Fisher River and Norway House and all over the country, but back to the northern part of Manitoba for many generations. My father, Paul, is a British immigrant to Canada and moved to a town called Manitou, named after Manitou, the Great Mystery, where he met my mother. And the rest, they say, is kind of like a high school musical. I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a bit of a cranky one at that. To the chagrin of most of my colleagues, I make my primary scholarly home and contributions outside of psychology and Indigenous studies and in the fields of education, health and social policy, and social and environmental studies. But I do keep my foot in the world of shrinks as a registered psychologist, and I'm involved in a training of many emerging Indigenous psychologists here in Canada or in Canada. I'm in Australia at the moment. Sometimes you forget where you are when you're on the internet. But yeah, I come to this conversation today very eager to learn and deepen my own analysis of what's happening in relationship to fraud in the Canadian Academy. I come as somebody who has real concerns about or has known someone who has concerns about fraudulent claims to Indigenous identity within the Canadian university system. Every university that I've been a part of in Canada, which is 3, has had somebody with whom whispers were present about. And I come to this also as a Canada Research Chair, aware of the growing numbers of Indigenous chairholders and yet deeply concerned about the potential of fraud amongst many of its members. I feel deeply aware that seldom issues as complex as identity and fraud are ever dealt with simple answers. I think these are complex issues that warrant complex conversations. I'm gonna try to say that from the beginning, I feel very ambivalent and critical about psychological factors as the basis for our thinking about racial identity fraud. I think a focus on individual psychological factors can lead to really simplistic or reductionist ways of understanding identity, race, belonging, citizenship, and the motivations of people who fraudulently navigate these terrains. From my perspective, it's far more important to consider the broader structural forces at play: racism, colonialism, capitalism, and various forms of inequality that may contribute to these phenomena, and to keep a critical eye on the very thing that pushes us towards seeking psychological answers. That is, maybe to ask ourselves the reasons why we may be looking for a psychological basis to racial identity fraud. I think one reason is that this behavior is inherently deceptive. It involves the misrepresentation of oneself and often of other people. And more often than not, it's intentional, which suggests that there may be some underlying, even pathological factors driving the behavior. There's a long history of Western psychological research on the topic of identity, and also psychological research conducted by Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people on the topic of racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. Very little psychological research on the construct of Indigenous citizenship. But ultimately, these ways of talking, I do think, are part and parcel about how people have come to misrepresent their claims to Indigenous identity. We have to hold it all of this research with a grain of salt, because in fact, while there's a long history of this research, there's very little empirical or phenomenological evidence supporting these theories. It's actually quite scarce if you look at the data and you look at the research base. And then I think complicating matters is that there is, even amidst the research that has emerged in the last 40 years from Indigenous psychologists and scholars working in the fields of psychology like me on the topic of cultural identity, until quite recently, much of this research is largely taken for granted in its framing that those seeking to enrich or develop their identity as Indigenous peoples reconnect, resurge, reconstitute connections to community, to land, to water, are doing so from the positionality of genuine belonging, which is a presumption that has to shift, something that I think is rapidly shifting in our paradigms. The predominant theories about why people engage in racial identity fraud are worth sharing, are worth revisiting. And probably the most prominent theory from psychological literature is a hypothesis rooted in social identity theory, which basically suggests, in a crude, quick and dirty way, I might say, is that it gives people an advantage or a benefit in their association with a particular racial or ethnic group. For example, people might believe that being perceived as Indigenous will give them greater access to certain jobs, educational opportunities, social networks, or opportunity in general. Is this a perverse view of Indigenous people's history in Canada? Absolutely, yes. The fact is that Indigenous people have been systematically deprived of opportunities And just because there's a moment in time following the TRC where there are some increased opportunities, the myth that there is widespread opportunity is simply that. Is it self-interested? Yes. Is this extractive? Yes. Is it anything new? No. But pragmatically speaking, particularly following the TRC, there are greater risks for this to occur where people's perception of opportunity is greater. The key takeaway for me from this theory is that with greater opportunity comes a greater need for scrutiny. Another explanation that is often cited, especially from social psychology, is that people who commit racial identity fraud do so as a result of personal insecurity, a desire for acceptance. And I think this is an interesting theory, but doesn't have a lot of empirical weight. But from a cultural perspective, I think there's actually there's a couple things to be said here. One is something to be said about the abysmal state of whiteness, the alienation and incoherence of cultural and social roles and responsibilities that colonial societies produce for themselves. I think about this as like a bit like vampiric, like vampires, in the absence of a strong sense of cultural identity, it can be tempting for some to seek to over-identify with groups that hold a stronger sense of coherent identity. They have culture and I want that. That feels good, I want that too. I think this is a really important issue to think about and contextualize within the history of Indigenous education in universities in Canada. When Indigenous people started entering the Canadian Academy, and in much smaller numbers than what might be common today, every Indigenous scholar had to carve out space in the university, safe space in the university to thrive, to navigate the precarious violence of these institutions. Having worked and directed a Center for Indigenous Education, I know that one of the things that has come to characterize these spaces is a profound hospitality and radical inclusion. The problem with that same ethos, or what that ethos can generate ripe grounds for, is that people with a very incoherent sense of identity find themselves drawn to these spaces, welcomed in these spaces, but also come to extract from these spaces. This is made all the more complicated in Canada by a real history of alienation of Indigenous people from their communities. My mother, a 60 scoop survivor, my grandmother before that, residential school survivors for generations, truly navigate this issue of alienation and disconnection from communities, which is a very different journey from that of people taking advantage of the hospitality of Indigenous people. Some also believe in maybe more like pathological, I appreciate Alex referring to it as sort of pseudoscience, because I don't know how much weight there is to it, except for to say that some people believe that racial identity fraud is based in a deep-seated psychological need to manipulate or to control. Some people believe that narcissism plays a role in racial identity fraud. But this relationship in terms of the research base is actually not very well understood. Narcissism, is a personality trait characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance, the need for affirmation, and a lack of empathy for others, which sort of sounds like the profile of most tenure-track faculty members in the Canadian Academy. But in fact, it can actually be quite a toxic trait that is very present among people who commit fraud. And I won't go into any examples because I'm sure all of us are conjuring a person in our mind as we talk about this. I think empathy is the key word here, though, that to think about really embodying a kind of fraudulent behavior, you really need to lack and have a distant sense of like responsibility to other people, and a lack of awareness of how extractive, how violent that act can be in relationship to others. People who have engaged in these sorts of deceptive behaviors, misrepresenting their racial identities, some research has suggested that these people have higher levels of narcissism. The challenge is that it's really important to note that not all individuals who engage in racial identity fraud exhibit those behaviors, and not all individuals who are narcissistic are frauds. There's lots of different factors that can contribute to it. But I do think what's really critical for us to understand about people who engage in this behavior is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people who commit racial identity fraud come to believe their own deceptions as fact. This is not always the case, But some research has shown that people who engage in racial identity fraud really experience a kind of self-deception where they come to believe their own lies or narratives, their own stories. This is often framed as a way of kind of living. They come to believe their lies as truth, suggesting a particularly profound emotional discomfort that could arise from that being disrupted. Like, to be confronted with a story that you've come to believe is truth is always sort of an unsettling experience. Sometimes people who are engaging in this behavior construct very elaborate stories, very almost spectacular life stories to enrich their claims. And this is not just to, sell all of us on their story, but part of that elaborate storytelling is also about convincing themselves. And over time, this can lead to a deep sense of confusion when their claims are challenged or exposed. You can really witness in these people a kind of grief or a kind of hurt. And it's not because they should be hurt by these challenges, but it's because they have actually come to believe these stories about themselves. People double down on these stories for lots of different reasons. If they feel threatened, if they feel like the resources that they've accumulated through this performance are threatened, status threatened, self-worth, self-esteem, all these sorts of things. And people also experience real grief. They feel like, in the case of people who may have really glommed on to Indigenous identities as a way of feeling a greater sense of coherence in their own life, when that is disrupted, feel a real loss of community. I think these hold profound implications, but don't change the very basic fact that at its core, the behavior is deceptive. It is a lie. How we come to believe these behaviors, how we come to story these behaviors are really complex, and we shouldn't oversimplify their complexity. That the grief or loss people experience requires real care, requires real empathy, but it's predicated on a lack of empathy for Indigenous people who actually live as Indigenous people. I guess I want to just conclude by saying that I don't think the category of identity is the most helpful category, because it's a category that's actually used as a means of justifying claims when it speaks very little to the question of political identity or citizenship. And moreover, to Dr. Wilson's point, it doesn't speak at all to the ontological claims, the cosmological claims that Indigenous people embody in our lives and community relationships and with the land and with one another. And so I think that while there's an incredibly diverse and vast array of literature that's emerged in the last 30 to 40 years on cultural identity formation and the importance of cultural formation and the importance of extending pathways to cultural revitalization for those alienated from their own cultures, we need to really work at reframing that project within the parameters of how that is extended to how that belonging is extended within the frame of political and spiritual belonging within nations. I guess I'll just say thank you to you all for listening, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I hope these have been some helpful provocations to consider. Looking forward to hearing from you, Adam.
Miigwech, Dr. Ansloos. And now we'll welcome Dr. Adam Murry.
Thank you. Dagute, Jeffrey, thank you for those good words. Alex, thank you for those good words, both of them. I'm so glad I went last. You put so much important kind of pillars of the conversation out there that I'm hoping that my inadequacies to talk about these topics are like well couched in the context that you all laid out. I appreciate getting to be here with y'all today and getting a chance to share some thoughts. I moved up to Calgary about 6 years ago to Treaty 7, territory of Blackfoot Confederacy with Pekani and Siksika and Ghana in the surrounding area, Tsuut'ina bordering our city, and then Stoney Nakoda to our west, Goodstoney, Chiniki, and Bearspaw First Nations. I moved up, I was living in Tucson before this and Oregon before that. And I was actually born in Oregon, but I grew up in Los Angeles. My mom is my mom's family came from the Ukraine about 100 years ago to the US. My dad's family is Irish on his dad's side and Apache on his mom's side. They had both moved out to Los Angeles in the 50s. And I think that I just would have been I don't know, another disconnected story had it not been for my old man, Brian Brightcloud, and my aunt, Judy Wiley, who are both advocates for urban Indian affairs. My aunt working in Native services for Native families that have children with disabilities. And my old man, apart from working with like the Southern California Indian Council, and we put on a couple of powwows in Southern California, the Santa Fe Springs powwow we did for about 19 years, and the Pasadena powwow for about 23 years. And we'd still be doing it if my old man's health issues wouldn't have took him from us in February last year. So anyway, I went and got educated and have been trying to utilize my research skills to do things with folks that I think are useful and important. And like a nerd, I went ahead and put together a couple of slides to help me keep my train of thought here. And so if it's okay with y'all, I'm gonna share it. The way that I kind of understood today was with this kind of broad question that we got put with, which was why non-Indigenous peoples would take on false claims in the first place, and then why they would double down when called to address their claims. And I kind of want to, say it up front, like, I don't know why people do what they do, especially any given individual. And I want to throw it out there that in the psychological world, there's actually lots of different kinds of psychology. And I feel like the clinical folks would be the best ones to speak about false identity claims. My own training, I'm in what's called industrial organizational psychology, which largely consults with organizations and programs and stuff like that. Probably 95% of my colleagues work for either military or big business, corporate, that kind of stuff. And so I've really been kind of engaged as a psychologist more with like number crunching and analyzing data. And like Jeffrey, my research is kind of spread out all over the place depending on who I happen to be working with. So that involves health research, education research, or substance use research, training, whatever really that wherever the need is, like I just try to join with other folks to contribute however I can. And so I thought it's worth saying because I've heard it a lot, when these false identity claims are exposed, like there's a ripple where everyone kind of does their own self-assessment. They're like, oh my gosh, we were talking about this in Ottawa related to that Indigenous primary healthcare and policy research network that Mika told Alice introduced me with. That I guess like for people who are of mixed ethnicity, people who are disconnected from their culture, all of these things re-traumatize and make people feel like they're emphasize areas of themselves that are not there. And so I want to make this distinction that I'm not talking about what I might call complex identities. This little diagram. This is just something that I kind of put together from recollection, from just growing up in a very multicultural space, and meeting lots of different people. You know, when I don't know how to say this any other way, but you know, when you meet people across different spaces, you know, you can kind of like suss out, you know, these different elements of indigeneity. You know, whether or not someone is enrolled or has status or not, of course, is a big one. Having their language. In the U.S., where I'm from, we talk about blood quantum a lot, our family lineage, and then, you know, were you res or urban, and then are you involved, are you assimilated, are you acculturated? And I think that the confused identities and the complex identities, this is a whole separate thing, right? I know that there's like a lot of identity politics that goes on even amongst Native people, and you know, this is not something that I think it's a separate topic altogether too. You know, this is fake identity as a false identity. Again, you know, trying to be sensitive. This topic, when you know, when it came up, it's like, oh, you know, it's like a stomach punch just thinking about it. You know, but everybody knows, you know, that it happens. My old man, he was a Northern traditional dancer. In the urban center, powwows are a big deal, and we used to have. This is I don't know if I should tell the story. There used to be my old man had the Mountain Dew challenge, and so he had people come up to him all the time. And when I was a little boy, I'd be sitting on, you know, on our blanket, and he'd be sitting down in between dances, and people would come up to him all the time. And he said, "Adam," and he'd lean over to me and he'd go, "If that person, see that person over there?" And I'd look over, and he goes, "If they come over to me and tell me that they're Cherokee, you got to go get me a Mountain Dew." And it's okay. And so that was my job. I'd have to go and run and get Mountain Dews. And every powwow, this was kind of like a running joke. Didn't think nothing of it really, you know. And this was in Los Angeles, you know. I mean, so we were right next door, you know, Hollywood, and so we would go to powwows, and there'd be easy parking, not long lines, and then you'd have a movie like Dances with Wolves or something that come out, and all of a sudden, parking was packed and the lines are full, and so you know, you'd get this type of energy around, and so I thought the stuff, you know, Alex was talking about the disconnection and the opportunity to connect, and Jeffrey talking about all the, man, so many good words so far about like individual explanations versus more cultural influences, and so I this is not my area of expertise, and so I just want to throw it out there, like I'm not super qualified to be talking about this stuff, but I figured, you know, it is an important topic. My one of my mentors when I was at Portland State University, Kiowa Comanche brother, Cornell Payrowardy, I know that he had been at least researching whether or not Indigenous students thought identity fraud was a problem back in the 90s, and but other than that, I don't know of any empirical research specific on Indigenous identity fraud. And so I thought, well, heck, let's look at identity fraud in other places. And in industrial organizational psychology, it comes up as a security risk because people do it so much. And this is kind of like, well, that's just crime. But then it comes up also like in interviews. People misrepresent who they are in small ways all the time for money, for jobs, employment. I went to a talk once at the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, our annual conference. This was back in 2010, I guess, and they had this whole panel just talking about how applicants fake and how we can account for it or control for it or catch it or whatever in interview context. And it came out, one of the panel members said, my concern is when applicants can't fake, like they know that there's something they should be lying about and they can't even stop themselves, you know, like trying to say that maybe impression management is an important job skill, right? But we know that like from some of the empirical research out there that people will overemphasize how responsible, how dutiful they are, and even how emotionally stable they are in compared to folks that are not applying for a job. We've seen instances in the non-Indigenous identity fraud world where folks will take on false identities for sympathy or for compassion from others. That Munchausen, I think Mika was saying, you know, this is where, you know, people will try to get attention, affection, that type of stuff from a false identity. There's examples of folks falsifying identity so that their ideas, which would maybe be discredited because of who they are, gain authority with a false identity. And then this other one about self-esteem and sense of belonging that Jeff mentioned, but I want to take it a little bit a different direction. I also train jujitsu, so I thought it was worth saying that like this is a problem that a lot of folks, any community will have like these individuals that will kind of take on a persona that's not theirs to gain access to the credibility and status and affection and all that stuff. And I thought I'd throw it out there real quick that there's whole websites, whole Instagrams and Facebook folks for people who show up to gyms and call people out, people that I look up other people's records. And so this is something that's like, this is not just a unique, even though for our context, we got to think about solutions to this in terms of the broader structures that's specific to Indigenous identity fraud. As a human thing, it's something that's happening a lot. And I don't know social psych very much or clinical psych, like I said, but there is this idea about false versus true selves that this psychologist Winnicott put out back in the 50s, where he argued that from the first time we meet disapproval from others, we start crafting a self that's different from our true self, I guess. And that this false self that we create, it has negative ramifications. And maybe if it's a small amount, you know, and this is this difference where you want to love yourself, you want to accept yourself, you want this comes with all kinds of awareness and ability to adapt and ability to compensate for weaknesses if they exist, and not embracing some alternative version of who you are that it creates difficulties and more emotional conflicts that you then have to negotiate with, right? And it causes dissonance, and so it's actually like an evolving identity that maybe starts out small, but if we think about it like a continuum, you know, maybe the folks that end up in these spots are like these exaggerated versions of things. Maybe time and coincidence put all the right recipe together to where it ended up, you know, where an individual might have to put the shoes on of a different identity more long-term than they ever had meant it, or it became public or something like that. Jeffrey, when you were talking about the research not being out there, not being very good, like I said, this is not my area, but I did find a little bit when looking at how people put up fake personalities up on Facebook. And there has been data to show that people who are more anxious and more avoidant have lower self-esteem, lower sense of authenticity, and that those folks are more likely to put up false identities in public spaces. So again, this is, you know, stuff from other areas, but thinking, you know, okay, well, you know, why double down? Again, this is, you know, taken to the next step, and here we are just postulating, you know, like I said, we've never gotten to sit in the room and really work with anybody, talk with folks. You know, there's not like empirical evidence on this, but you know, the evidence that is out there, you know, that these risks for false identities is it's true. Like you will loss of access to the rewards, if you've gotten affirmation or esteem or employment or whatever, like that those things are at risk, and so, you know, that's an incentive to double down. There is, I guess, like this different strata false identity, if you want to think like that there's folks that know that they're deceiving and are just trying to work the system, you know, versus like folks that maybe it is more pathological in the sense that you know, they start to believe a different version of themselves. I loved it, Jeffrey, when you said about having to face ideas that we have that are not true. It's hard, no matter what it is. And then this one being wrapped up with your self-identity, right, even becomes a shameful or disgraceful thing in and of itself. And then, you know, for doubling down, I thought it was worth throwing out cognitive dissonance, because that's a thing we know a pretty good amount. And basically, cognitive dissonance is this idea where when your thoughts and your behaviors are different from one another, that we do something to resolve that discrepancy, and that discrepancy, it bothers us as humans. And so if I know that something's not good for me, once I find that out, it's harder for me to get joy from doing that thing. Well, I got to do something about that. I either got to stop having them smoke breaks, or I either got to change the belief and be like, well, maybe it ain't that bad. It's not that much, you know, but something's got to change. Here's this little kind of diagram of the way that we make sense of it. We basically rationalize it one way or the other, and consistency is viewed as like a positive flow of energy, so that these two things are not combating with one another. So I hope that wasn't you know, too nerdy of a deep dive, I guess. Like I said, this is something that I'm kind of learning about on the empirical side, you know, just for this conversation. And so if we're thinking about it as this is a thing that happens all over the place, and that this is a thing that's always happened, and that where we're encountering it is just because of the community definition that we're talking about, well, then it's not so much is it going to happen, but what do we do when it happens in the institutional sense, so that it doesn't become Alex, you were talking about taking over, like the white privilege taking over these Indigenous spaces, these spaces of kind of sanctuary, hard work spaces, politically fought for spaces, that if this is, if it's possible for someone to one day say, you know what, I think I want to join that space and take those things people are working for, that there's got to be some type of system in place to prevent that. And so at our university, this is a conversation that's going on. I'm a co-chair of a subcommittee 2 of our Indigenous strategy. It's called Top-a-Tope, Blackfoot word for a place where you take a rest on a journey. And this is, we're having conversations with HR, and it's you know, we're thinking about, okay, well, how do we basically verify that the person is who they say they are, in terms of hiring, promotion, recognitions, awards, grant funding. And then at the same time that that's happening, because there are easy cases of identity. In fact, you know, most of the cases, you know, you ask for the tribal enrollment card and then it's squashed, it's done. And but it's those complex identity pieces that this is where it's getting sticky, because a lot of faculty members and administrators who are Indigenous are also apprehensive to get involved with, like, saying this categorization, but everybody agrees that we don't want the decision to be made by corporate administrators that maybe are just like avoiding liability. There are indigenous definitions of indigeneity, and if someone's going to be regulating what it is, it should be Indigenous people. And so, as Jeffrey had pointed out, citizenship, right, is a whole other level of conversation that goes on beyond enrollment. Like in one of our classes, I had a student just last week say, you know, what about adoption? You know, in our old ways, adoption was a legitimate inclusion in the family. Does that, you know, would that count? And then, you know, thinking about after 500 years of assimilationist policies, wouldn't you expect there to be people all along the continuum in terms of how they fit into federal regulations like status and stuff like that. So, keeping the conversation where the control for identity is still defined by Indigenous people, but protected in terms of the way that institutions are encountering the Indigenous workforce. All right, well, I think that's all I got for that. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Okay.
Miigwech, Dr. Murray. So now we will, I guess, open it up for any questions, comments people might have to both our in-person participants and folks online. Yes.
Tanse, Savage Bear, Nitsiga song. All of you, thank you so much. You all have such different presenting styles, and I just love every one of you. One of the things I was wondering about that we were kind of talking about yesterday is we understand the doubling down. But what I'm curious about your thoughts is, what about the protectors of these people? Why are there so many people that are standing behind them and saying, yes, I want to adopt them. I'll bring them into, this community. What is the psychology behind that?
I'm happy to respond to that, to get us started on that. There's probably lots of different answers to that question. It's so strange. I can't see you, but I just heard your voice. So whoever you are, thank you for the question. I wish I could see your face. It's strange talking to a screen. But one of the things that I said earlier is that one of the arguments that's made about why people commit fraud is the perceived benefit, right? Economic opportunities, networks, power. I think the reason why people protect frauds is very similar. And that's maybe a harsh read on some of our relations, but I think it's worth saying that if you look at some of the high profile cases of fraud that have come out in the last 24 months, those who are quick to rush to defend often have a vested interest in the narrative, the story of the genuineness of these people. They too have something, they too have skin in the game. They have something invested, whether it's a kind of power or a kind of economic benefit. They're not neutral parties. In some cases, they have benefited from that person's presence. And I guess the most real example of this is the way that universities benefit and stand behind frauds in defense of their equity targets. They get something institutionally in relationship to broader funding packages from research councils by being able to report something about the number of Indigenous faculty that they have. To destabilize that is threatening. It threatens economic security. It threatens a number of other benefits. And so I think it's a real example of the ways that people protect for their own self-interest. And often people renege on those defenses of people as soon as they begin to recognize that the public isn't siding with them. And then it no longer becomes advantageous. They're no longer benefiting from that association. There's a lot of self-interest. It's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I can just add to that too. And I think it connects to the question that Geraldine King has asked in the Q&A there. And I think it can be explained also in terms of relationality. And people that are the pretendians are from the most marginalized communities within their own spheres. So like, queer or trans or disabled people that are seeking some kind of connection and validation of identity. And so maybe people have some kind of relationship with them, but also with the narrative that reinforces heteropatriarchy. And so everybody is kind of trained to reinforce heteropatriarchy, and it takes a lot to kind of throw a stick in the spokes of it, so to speak. And so I think that's maybe where some of the bullying and doubling down comes from, is like, it's really hard to disconnect. And so if you have a connection with somebody for whatever reason, even if it's like completely dysfunctional, people may double down to kind of strengthen that relationship or maintain that relationship. And I mean, we see that in our communities when people stand up for abusers, or, you know, people that have committed sexual abuse or different kinds of violence, is like, you know, often people will step in and support or defend them. And I think it's because of relationality. And then linking to the question that Geraldine asked about disconnection, and yes, absolutely disconnection from land, because that fundamentally within our own psychological systems and structures was the thing that like literally grounds us. And when I say land, I always mean water and sky and everything connected to land, not just dirt, right? And so that kind of level of spirituality that has intentionally been severed through different governmental policy has led to disconnections in many forms. And for people that, one, are disconnected in a way from, you know, Indigenous folks that are disconnected, may want to connect with people that, you know, are performing this indigeneity. And then the people that are performing indigeneity may be disconnected from their own spiritual belief systems because they don't align with them. Maybe, you know, Abrahamic religions and other ones that have, again, reinforced heteropatriarchy and enacted violence. So, you know, they don't want to connect with that worldview. So I think it always does come back to land and spirit, and understanding like the fragmentation that has been caused by colonial processes can lead to fragmentations also in people's thinking and behaviors.
Miigwech, we'll actually go and read the Geraldine King's question online.
So just to make sure that everybody hears the question, Geraldine was asking about specifically, Dr. Wilson, your Queering Land-Based Education presentation, where you previously warned that Indigenous land-based learning is quickly becoming a fad, and to avoid that. So Geraldine wanted to ask how you think that as settler colonials, a fraudster's lack of rightful claims and connection to our land may play into this. In short, how does the lack of rightful claims to land figure into the psychology and performance of identity fraud?
Is there anything more that anybody want to add to that question?
Yeah, I think it, I mentioned earlier about styles of leadership and land defense and the ways that that kind of plays out. And, you know, if these big oil companies are giving national awards, it's definitely a gaze that does not respect connection to land. And, you know, schools, land-based education is all across the country now. And it's more than a fad now, it's entrenched, and often sometimes is just replicating colonialism outside, you know, taking it outside. So I think they're very much linked, and the increased intrusion of, well, neoliberalism really, corporations, oil, resource extraction, curriculum awards, all of those things play a part of it for sure.
I just really agree with that, Alex. The comment about resource companies is so piercing, because there are numerous universities in Canada that have Indigenous research endowed positions funded by companies that are actively contributing to environmental catastrophe in our nations. And I think about that, and it's such a vivid like demonstration, I think, of the ways in which the self, like the economic and the social motivators for performing a particular identity. I also generally find it's difficult to say this, but I think sometimes in the absence of real relationships to land and rightful claims to place, people tend to fabricate very like highly performative and almost like mythical narrations of like land that don't reflect certainly not my experience, and not my experience, not the only experience, but that are really rooted in racist depictions, very tokenizing depictions of Indigenous peoples' land-based relationships that come from Hollywood, or that come from like colonial, like Victorian fiction. And so I think that, you know, there's like one of the litmus tests for me is how weird the kind of like way of talking about land-based relationships gets. Is it actually connected to language? Is it actually connected to people? Or is it speaking about land in ways that are really instrumentalizing, depersonalizing, and at the same time, like kind of in bed with the very organizations and corporate interests that are destroying it? I think these are like very practical ways of thinking about the accountability piece.
Miigwech, do we have another question?
First, thank you for the really interesting conversation. My name is Curtis Boyer. I work at the University of Saskatchewan in the Policy School. Dr. Wilson, you had mentioned the term epistemicide, and it got me thinking about epistemic injustice. And so my question is, and this could go to all three of you. What do you think the link is between the ability to claim that you're an Indigenous person or you're not, and the ability to believe that and have others believe that, and the kind of the colonial legacy and how's that impacted our ability as Indigenous peoples, Métis, First Nation, Inuit, to enforce the meaning and value of who we are onto other people? In other words, what is the link between epistemic injustice and fraud, Indigenous identity fraud?
Well, I think they're intimately intertwined because, you know, epistemic justice or epistemicide, the other aspect to it is severing of our intergenerational knowledge, which is linked to land. And fraud is making up that connection or making up that knowledge. So they're just creating their own knowledge that's not rooted in intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Good question, though. I'll have to think about it more.
It's deep, right? Because it's almost like if there's the severance, and we talk about this like in the methodologies landscape, where Indigenous epistemologies are, if there's a space where they're allowed to flourish, and then how do people evaluate quality within that sphere? And if the institutions that, let's say in the context of reconciliation, have the political will now to want to make space, but don't know what it looks like, that this is like ripe territory then for someone to say, hey, look at the beads and feathers, this is an Indigenous epistemology, and get that through, and the system wouldn't have the immunity to detect it, or the antivirus or something. And so in that way, the collusion, I guess, might be unintentional, right? To like create a self-serving form of Indigenous perspective. It's almost like I want to like think about this on a sphere, or not a sphere, like on a spectrum. You know, like if someone is helping at some high school, some nowheresville, and you say, oh, you know, who are you? And they tell you their identity and they allude to indigeneity. and they're taking out trashes and helping clean tables, and I don't know, they're just hanging out. It's like, well, the consequence there is not the same in terms of epistemic violence than it would be if someone is sitting as a kind of research chair, right, proclaiming to represent that perspective on an institutional level. And then like the way that people will defend that person, I think also the reasons differ, whether or not it's somebody with no power doing, just helping out in some invisible space versus someone where there are a lot of vested interests in maintaining that productivity machine. I like that point that you made, Alex, about the relationality, because I think that in the context of all of this stuff, people do still care about one another and are looking out for each other, and there's, you know, perhaps real relationships happening even within the context of the deception. And you know, I know from one story that I don't want to share the person's name, but they, you know, they had said that one of the people that had gotten exposed stayed with them for months, and over the course of those months, right, like did stuff together and watched Netflix together, you know, like there was all these I guess non-trivial interactions, right, but the openness to have engaged in that interaction was because of false pretense.
Miigwech, I think we're going to go to a question online, and then we'll go to Michelle.
We have a couple of questions online that are just asking if the panelists can explain a little bit more about the psychology between fraudsters who are exposed and then double down.
Well, I think anytime we're exposed in a lie, it's not fun. It's, I think, you know, it requires us to think about our impact on other people, and it requires us to decide the question about whether we want to, I think like ultimately what it implicates is more a question of moral responsibility. Like, what are you going to do when confronted with your own deception? And people have a wide range of responses to that. But when the stakes are as high as your income, or when the stakes are as high as exerting tremendous power over legal precedent in Canada, or health funding in research in Canada, or you name it, or if you're the president of a university, you know, the stakes become so significant for these individuals, and their doubling down is really rooted in, I would say, a lot of psychological theory would say that their doubling down is rooted in self-resource preservation. It's short-sighted. It's ultimately an ineffective strategy. But that immediate sort of like visceral response is not anchored in empathy. It's not really taking in and considering and really hearing the impact that they've had on another. It's really more primarily an assessment of their own sense of threat. The doubling down, I think, met with the kind of targeting of people who challenge or confront. It just tells, I think, us more and more about the lack of genuineness about the claim in the first place. But it is a move to self-defense out of a perception of threatening. I don't think that should make Indigenous people more soft-spoken about the issue, though. Just because people feel threatened in their power doesn't mean their power shouldn't be threatened. It shouldn't be challenged. It shouldn't be unsettled. And I will say I have had the experience of confronting a colleague very gently to just ask how they understood their identity. Not just to assume that what I had heard was true, but inviting them to speak to the question. Because from my vantage point, I mean, I get asked all the time, where am I from? Who are your people? And I have a weird last name that doesn't sound like it's from Fisher River, which is part of the story, right? How do we come by these names? How do our people move? And it shouldn't be a threatening thing for me to speak to that. So even confronting this colleague in a really gentle way, what it evoked, right? What it evoked from them was so revealing about how threatened they were by the very question. Something that shouldn't threaten us as people if we have nothing to hide. So I don't know if that maybe speaks further to the dynamic you're hoping to hear about, but that's sort of the things that come to my mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, that often it is fear-based. So fear leads to certain kind of reactions from people. And I think it's really interesting to like analyze and observe and analyze how people react to fraudsters. So it's there's definitely a gendered phenomenon. And I would say also queered phenomenon about the way that people react. So if it's a woman that is committing identity fraud, it's a very different reaction from the general public than if it's a man. So like, for example, the difference between people, the way that people responded to Joseph Boyden, who also identified as Two-Spirit, which kind of surprised a lot of people, compared to like, say, Carrie Barassa, that are two very public cases. So there's always these mechanisms of, again, heteropatriarchy that are in place in the way that people are trained to respond and react to different bodies and the way that different bodies look. And so people, the fraudsters are socialized themselves into reacting to, you know, out of fear in different ways. And often for people, for women, maybe their reaction will be that they're socialized to dissociate, and that there are, you know, there's plenty of research and, you know, even disciplines within relational psychology about this phenomenon of knowing, not knowing. And I think to a degree, every single person that's a fraudster convinces themselves that you know, that this story is true. So the doubling down is suppressing or dissociating from the knowing aspect, from the, you know, the knowing aspect of it to the not knowing. And so that happens on a societal level too. Like, how do these people continue to operate, you know, for so long, when on a level, you know, there's many people that know, or even society could know. And often it's because they conform to a certain kind of notion of that's palatable to the white gaze or to the male gaze, for example. And like I said, many of them perform right into it by the clothing they wear that can be hypersexualized or whatever, that appeals to the man that's making the decision or the company or whatever. And that just kind of reinforces their behavior and their knowing, not knowing kind of dissociation from reality. So I think fear plays a part of it too.
Miigwech. I'll go to Michelle.
Say hello. My name is Michelle Sisa. I'm a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and Treaty 6. And I really appreciate all of your perspectives on this. I think it's such a fascinating and tangled question. My question, I guess, is whether, you know, the field of psychology offers any pathway forward after the sort of shame and I guess, unmasking of a fraudster. I don't feel like any of the stories that I've seen of public figures who've lost their position of status as a supposed Indigenous person have really shown any paths to kind of restoration or reparation of that person's psyche, you know, people who've come to terms with their fraud or figured out how to apologize for it or live with it. It seems like we see a lot of doubling down, and then from what I've seen, people just tend to disappear. And I wonder if there's any models for people who can move forward and accept the harm that they've done and maybe provide, I don't know, some kind of example of how to move forward from that. I don't know if there's an analogy with like cult deprogrammers or people who've left Scientology, but I would love to know, what awaits on the other side, and if there are things that we can be doing as a community when we are holding these people accountable to move them past that point of shame towards, some kind of healing.
Well, I think the rehabilitation of white people is important work, but it's not everyone's work. I don't know that it should be the work of Indigenous scholars in the academy. I think we have a lot of work to do to find dignity for our communities. But I do think one of the comments I would have would be that there's a real tension here inherent in the really important question you've asked, which is, partly these moments represent something societally, and demand in some respects the opportunity for like transitional forms of justice, like truth-telling about the deception, reparations for the impacts that it's had. And I don't know that we have like the kind of like broad-based mechanisms to do that within universities yet. But at the same time, it's also a very like deeply individual and like interpersonal journey. And I think one that probably would require like very structured forms of restorative justice between people who have been harmed by these actors. There are some good models for that kind of work with people, but what's necessary to even engage that work is people have to be willing to sit in the very painful, difficult truth of their own deception. So a lot of times people disappear into the kind of we don't hear from people again, in part because there hasn't been a willingness to have that conversation. And I think when people have attempted kind of a public conversation about it, it's just far too it's about timing. I don't know that we're ready to devote space to these people in context where like our communities are still asking for clean water. Like for me, those are the kind of like, those are the stakes I hold. It's like, what's the priority to restore these people or to like save our nation's lives? Those are like, maybe that's a false, I don't know, maybe that's a false like positioning of the issue, but I do think we're straddling like an interpersonal resolution piece with something that actually is much more structural. And the challenge is that structural mechanisms of transitional justice actually don't map on very easily to these interpersonal experiences of grief and loss and violence. They're much, I guess, stickier than that. But I don't know, maybe Adam or Alex has a different perspective.
We have a question. Maybe that we'll take a final question here. One more question we have time for.
Okay. Oh. Angela Jaime at the University of Saskatchewan. And it's just sort of a follow-up of the question and then the comments by the panel. I think and Michelle's poignant question about the sort of dormancy of those that have doubled down or have brought out. I think my bigger concern is when they go away, what are they doing? And we know that Terry Barras is bringing some things forward, right? So without policies, without processes, we will have more fraudulent claims, and those that are making those fraudulent claims come forward and have legal standings without policies, without process. At the University of Saskatchewan, we have a policy. We passed that in July of last year. We have a website that explains that. And it's those kinds of processes, and no policy is going to be perfect, but we have to work together. We have to start collaborating to make those policies better and stronger so that when the fraudulent claims do come forward, that individuals don't have recourse to sue individuals or institutions or organizations like NULSA, they wouldn't have that kind of standing. So we have to protect ourselves in that way.
Miigwech. And are we good for, you have a little bit more time? Okay.
Thanks. Hi, this is Vicki George, University of British Columbia, Vancouver. I have a question to our speakers. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to talk about the gaslighting and harm that happens when somebody is exposed, the whistleblowers, if you will, and how the fraudster makes us out to be the bad ones. And then it becomes about them. It becomes about their feelings, their positionality, and often exemplifies a superior attitude. And then second part is, and these are just for your comments, if people and or institutions become silent, that too is a form of further harm. Do you think we need to talk about the gaslighting and the silence that can happen? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that we're all aware of it, and I agree that institutions become complicit when they don't step up and defend actual Indigenous people and Indigenous faculty, staff, and students. And yeah, they become complicit in just reinforcing that kind of violence. In terms of psychological processes that are happening, I mean, there's so many going on. And there's so many different ways to explain structural violence and individual violence as well. And I'm glad that there are people from the administration of U of S here, because it's an ongoing dialogue that we're having right now. You know, yeah, we have a policy, and yes, it definitely needs more work. So I'm glad that there's an acknowledgement of that.
Two complaints processes and institutions are a really interesting example of how some of the very policies that are meant to kind of provide avenues for people to raise concerns, to whistleblow, end up becoming turned against people. I think in 2020 or 2021, Sarah Aubrey came out with a new book on complaints, looking really at the use of institutional complaints processes. And I think institutions are different than people, but they mirror a lot of similar processes. And so, yeah, I do think gaslighting is a great word for it. And I think at the end of the day, we can't expect institutions. I mean, I think we want to expect institutions, but we can't expect institutions to defend the rights of Indigenous people. And so, yeah, I mean, it is unsurprising in many ways that institutions increasingly subject to neoliberal governance that are run by lawyers are primarily interested in sort of the protecting their interests and even advise Indigenous faculty to be very cautious in how they raise questions that veer into legislation protected under human rights codes and such. So it's a real thorny area. And I think one lesson that we've learned among colleagues that I've navigated some of this journey with is just the tremendous importance of raising concerns about individuals together, to raise concerns and bring accountability, but not alone, but to do it as a community. Partially so that it's not centered on individuals, that the backlash is not just distributed on one person, but the backlash, which is inevitable, is held in a broader collective. I think that is one bit of learning.
Miigwech, and we have one final question.
Hello? Okay. I want to call your attention to an email that came out this morning that was probably been sent to each and every one of your presidents and Indigenous leads, and by virtue of that, to your Indigenous leads at the universities. It's titled UFSK Truth Policy and Verification of Indigenous Identity. And it was sent by Sabrina Godin, Communications Lead for the Voices of Indigenous Peoples. And what it is really is lateral violence on the part of these individuals trying to gaslight us as we're doing the work we're doing here today. Obviously, this is timed to hit us on this day. Now, our university, Carleton, immediately sent it to my colleague here, Benny, and myself, and we're not sure how to respond, but I'm wondering, when we get things like this, how do we support each other at our different institutions in either a response, or sometimes they don't even merit a response, but how do we support each other in terms of dealing with this kind of the violence that happens? The emotional, the spiritual, the social, the institutional violence that takes place, because our colleagues at our institutions, our provosts and our presidents, they don't know the ins and outs of all of this better than like we do, right? So I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can, is there some way that we can we find a way to address this collectively and support each other as we encounter this kind of vitriol?
Miigwech, I think, that speaks to how folks that are trying to undermine this process can very much utilize those structures and systems that center whiteness, because we know we all work, many of us work with teams where we're the only Indigenous person on that senior leadership team. And there's varying degrees of knowledge across our institutions of those non-Indigenous peoples on this very topic. So I think, Miigwech, for that, maybe, again, that'll be a final thought for our panelists, like, what's the role of the collective, like, of addressing, these strategic, planned, coordinated forms of gaslighting and violence?
My short answer is I don't know. But I do think that this conversation, I appreciate getting to be a part of it, because part of, I think, figuring it out is understanding all the different dilemmas at stake, I guess. Just throughout this short conversation, we've been talking about the impacts on the institutional level and on the interpersonal level, the need to protect and also to reprimand on the institutional level. And then I really, appreciated that comment about the healing piece, and the healing piece going both ways, both for the people affected and the perpetrators. When you think about the solutions to this being housed in an institution, it's very vulnerable to being co-opted by, I would say, typical institutional processes. And this is an area where people are fighting for different ways of doing things. Indigenous ways of doing things, even within this contentious place. I do agree that there's this, this distracts from our attention in for a lot of other important areas. But if we think about it in terms of an injury taking place, how do we heal and recover from injuries in other spaces.
Miigwech. Okay, on that note, we'll, I think, extend our appreciation, our miigweches to our panelists today here. It's a very complex, big topic. So miigwech for taking us through that learning here. Maybe we can give everybody a round of applause before we break.
I would just like to again echo those that thank you, and I'd like to make this presentation to Dr. Pedri-Spade on behalf of the committee and all of us here. Again, it's one of those awesome Indigenous boxes, so here you go. Thank you very much to Dr. Jeffrey Ansloos, Dr. Alex Wilson, and Dr. Adam Murray, and again to Dr. Celeste Pedri-Spade for such for an awesome way to get going on day 2 here today.